Hey there. Welcome back to another episode of 5G Guys. This is Dan McVa, and my co-host Wayne Smith is not going to be with us for this episode. He's out traveling internationally, but the show must go on. So I'm going to run this episode solo. It's my first time running solo without Wayne, so it'll be interesting to see how it goes. But thanks as always for joining. Great to have you. As always, we've really appreciated all the outreach that folks have been doing through our website. Go to 5gguys.com if you haven't already. Check us out. Have had a lot of great feedback from listeners on episode ideas, questions, given some free advice to some listeners. So don't hesitate to reach out. As always, you can also connect with us through all your social channels, 5G Guys, and you'll be able to find us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, what have you. So anyways, today on this episode, what we're going to tackle is MVNO 101. So we always like to avoid acronyms, and here I just started out with one. So mobile virtual network operators. So another one in our series of 101 episodes, kind of going through the fundamentals and the basics. And mobile virtual network operators are a element of consumer and business cellular services worldwide that has to do with companies who sell service to users, but don't actually own and operate the network that those users are using. In the US, you'll hear of brands like Boost Mobile, Mint Mobile, and I'll go through some more of those later in the episode. But these are companies that basically buy capacity from the companies that own and operate the networks at a wholesale price, and they resell that to consumers or to business users. So really they're brands. They might have a store or a presence you can go into. They might be only online. They may sell you, or in most cases do sell you, devices, phones, things of that nature. They may have their own customer service, billing, things of that nature, but the actual network itself is not theirs, and they don't operate that network that is supporting you. So today we're just going to kind of go over that concept, talk a little bit more about it, kind of give some insight into how that world really works. So in the US, this concept really picked up steam around 2009 to 2012. At that time, the FCC was making a lot of regulatory changes to make it more friendly to consumers to be able to switch carriers. Early on, when you had service with a carrier and you wanted to switch, you were going to have to give up your phone number, for example, and get a new phone number to switch. You may have also been under a contract that would have large penalties if you left early, things of that nature. The FCC created some regulations that said that those phone numbers were no longer owned by the carrier, and that if you wanted to switch, you by law could take your number with you. So that was a big change. It's called number portability. That really opened up the ease of people not having to go through the brain damage of a whole new phone number to try to switch carriers, similar to, having to change your email address all the time. In addition, the FCC also put some regulations on the carriers that required them to have the systems and the processes to enable that portability within a minimum amount of time, so that when you left carrier A to go to carrier B, both carriers had an obligation to make sure that that transfer of service happened within a minimum amount of time. Those two regulations really opened up the ability for people to switch carriers. And with that came a lot of innovation around startups that said, well, hey, let me go negotiate to buy a bunch of capacity, a bunch of minutes from these network operators, package it and resell it to users under a virtual brand. Hey, real quick, a quick word of thanks to today's sponsor, Vertex Innovations, before we get started. For over 17 years, Vertex has been building the nation's wireless and broadband networks. Providing project management, network engineering, and construction oversight are just some of the ways Vertex helps their clients. So if you're looking for more of a partner to help you with your wireless network designs, construction, implementation, or operations, reach out to Vertex. You can find them at vertex-us.com. That's VERTEX-US.com. So that's kind of the history of how MVNOs started. And where we stand today is, for the most part in the US, there's kind of a distinction between mobile network operators who own and operate their networks and MVNOs. And that's really the case across the US. Across the world, excuse me. In the US, we've talked about this in prior episodes. Where we're really at right now is three major brands or operators that own and operate their networks. And most people are familiar with AT&T, T-Mobile, and Verizon. I used to call it the Big Four, now call it the Big Three, since T-Mobile has merged with Sprint. So really the Big Three are the big operators everyone knows about. We've also talked about in some other episodes that in addition to the Big Three, there's actually roughly another 80 to 90 regional network operators who own and operate smaller networks in typically more rural parts of the country. The largest of those regionals would be US Cellular, which many may have heard of. But there's a lot of other companies that also own and operate those networks, and you can buy service directly from them as well. And what'll happen is when you leave their network, you'll probably roam on to another regional carrier or one of the Big Three carriers' networks. But conversely, if you're a customer of one of the Big Three carriers and you travel into a lot of these areas that these regional network operators have networks, you're actually roaming and using that network operator's network, and they are basically charging the Big Three carrier for your ability to go on their network. So that's sort of the ecosystem, if you will, of companies that own and operate networks in the US. So we're looking at, roughly 90, 95 total operators in the United States, the Big Three, and then all those regionals. We do, by the way, have prospective fourth nationwide carrier in Dish Wireless that is building out a nationwide 5G network as we speak. We'll have a future episode to talk a little bit about what Dish is doing and what the prospect looks for their presence in the marketplace. If we go beyond those network operators, there's another roughly 140 companies in the United States that are mobile virtual network operators, MVNOs. So like I said, these companies are buying capacity wholesale from the companies that own the networks, and they're providing a brand, they're selling you service, providing customer care, billing, selling phones, accessories, things of that nature, but they don't actually operate that network. And so a lot of folks in the US are getting their service through these MVNOs. I'll go down an example of some of the top names you might be familiar with in that 140 companies. Xfinity Mobile, most people know about Xfinity, aka Comcast, where they get their cable television, maybe landline phone service, things of that nature. And you can now also get mobile phone service through Xfinity. They use Verizon's network, for example. So they're buying and reselling capacity off of Verizon's network. Cricket is another one. They're using AT&T's network. Boost Mobile was previously using Sprint's network. With that merger, that would now be T-Mobile. Metro by T-Mobile is an interesting one. It is owned by T-Mobile. It's a mobile virtual network operator using their own network. It's kind of an odd duck. They had bought Metro PCS, which was a network operator, took over all of their sites, all of their capacity, added them to their network, and then kept those customers as a separate customer base. And that's sort of how T-Mobile manages sort of a different tier of customers that are on the lower credit side, lower capability side. And so that's Metro by T-Mobile. So they're an MVNO operating on their own network, a bit of an odd duck. Mint Mobile, many people might have seen Ryan Reynolds and his commercials, also operates on T-Mobile using T-Mobile's network. And then there's some others that are pretty popular: Consumer Cellular, Straight Talk, and TracFone, for example. And these guys are interesting because they're not dedicated to just one of the Big Three's networks that they resell service from. Consumer Cellular uses both AT&T and T-Mobile's network. Talk and TracFone, they use all three of the Big Three carriers' networks. So that's just a subset. There's many more out there that I'm sure many have used and or are currently subscribed to. But that kind of gives you a sense. In the show notes, we'll actually include, so go to the website or the show notes when listening to this episode, there's a link of some good resources that you can go to learn more and to find out which MVNOs use which networks. The one that I like to go to is a website called whistleout.com. Whistle, like whistling a tune, whistleout.com is a great clearinghouse to see all of the various US-based MVNOs. And you can even drill into each one, see what kinds of prices they offer. You can see which networks they operate on. So it's a great resource. So if we talk a little bit about the MVNO network in the United States, some fundamentals just to kind of get a sense of what it looks like. Again, there's about 140 of them in the US. There's over 1,300 MVNOs. So quite a large set of companies that are providing this type of service. And in the US, in the late, about, it was 2019, 2020, according to some analysts, MVNOs were at a market value of about $13 billion in the US. They're forecast to go up to about $16 billion here in the next couple of years, according to some analysts. So some, serious market size. They accounted in 2019 for about 36 million subscribers. To give you a sense, that's roughly 7% of the total subscribers of cellular service in the US. So these MVNOs collectively are accounting for less than 10% market share. That kind of gives you a sense for where they stand in the bigger picture. Beyond those fundamentals, though, I think what's important, and I get a lot of questions from people about, help me understand, why wouldn't I go buy service from Xfinity if it's really the same as Verizon? What's the difference? Am I getting the same thing? Is it different? So I wanted to chat a little bit in this episode about my experience, my knowledge of what the big differences are between if you go directly to a big three versus an MVNO. I think the most obvious difference that you're going to find is you're going to have a better ability to get a more affordable package, better pricing with an MVNO. They're getting the capacity on these networks at a wholesale price that's less than we as consumers are buying directly. And this is really more of a focus on the consumer side. And that savings is going to be passed along to their customers more often than not. So if you're very price conscious, if you've got a large family, things of that nature, MVNOs can be a great option to really shop to get the best value for your service. Now, one thing that I did just kind of touch on is that, especially in the US, MVNOs are very consumer focused. There's not a lot of MVNOs that provide business level services. Internationally, that's a bit different. And that's not always the case. There are some business level type MVNOs out there, but typically, if you're a corporation that has large user accounts and things of that nature, you're really not going to be looking at MVNO as an option. You're going to be going direct to one of the big three. So this is really more of a consumer-focused perspective and discussion. Beyond pricing, though, I think the flip side that you're oftentimes going to see is you may have compromised quality of service, compromised throughput, things of that nature when you hitch your wagon to an MVNO over going direct to a big three. And the reason for that, this really is partially the result of the elimination of a US FCC policy called net neutrality that occurred in 2017. What net neutrality basically said was that the US was sort of regulating, saying that, hey, as a provider of services, whether it be Netflix, Verizon, Xfinity, cable internet service, whatever the case might be, that you had to offer the same levels of service to all customers. And when the FCC in 2017 got rid of net neutrality, what it did was it said, hey, as a network owner and operator, I can provide different levels of service to different customers. That would allow a carrier, for example, to say, hey, if you pay a higher price, I'll give you a higher guaranteed quality of service or higher throughputs, for example. And we see that today. You can go to Verizon, AT&T, and you can buy different tiers of unlimited. And you might ask, well, if it's unlimited, it's unlimited. Well, at a higher tier, you're possibly going to get faster throughputs than someone right next to you that's paying a lower tier when you're under network congestion, for example. When you take that same concept and you bring it to an MVNO, oftentimes what is happening is those big three carriers are putting some throttling on that network access that they are providing to the MVNO's customers. So that MVNO customer may be throttled or may not have the same level of access to the network that a customer that's buying service directly from that same big three network might get. So I think that's sort of the trade-off that you might see when you get better pricing is you may not, in a congested situation, maybe at a football game or something of that nature, you may not see the same level of service as a customer that's buying directly from the big three carrier. So I think that's the biggest two items that I know as being a big difference. The other thing that's an interesting kind of after effect that you see is that in general, when you look at third-party companies that are rating customer service across companies within the space of MVNOs and network operators, it's interesting what shakes out is oftentimes the MVNOs actually get higher average customer service ratings than the companies that own and operate the networks. Now that's, you're going to find cases where that's not always the case, but on average, that's been an interesting outcome. I think it was in 2019 or 2020, a third party company that rates customer service ratings rated on average MVNOs at a rating of 77 versus 73 for those mobile network operators. So, and that same report listed companies like Cricket, Metro, Virgin, Boost Mobile, Consumer Cellular had some of the best customer service ratings across the entire community of network operators, whether that be MVNOs or direct big three carriers. So that's an interesting kind of trade-off that you might find. You get a little bit better customer service with an MVNO. The other big thing to speak to that I've also seen to be a difference is when you go direct to the big three, you're more often, and this is again not a rule, but more often what you're going to find is that if you've got a more advanced technical problem that needs to be solved, you're going to have a better opportunity to get that solved from a big three carrier, from the network operator, because they actually have the engineers that operate that network. The MVNO is only going to help you with certain things like billing issues and questions about your service and things like that. At some point, if there's a problem in the network that's impacting you as a customer, they're just going to have to pass that off to the network operator that owns and operates that network. So with a subscription directly to one of those carriers, you're more likely going to get that more advanced technical solution to your problem if that indeed is happening to you. You're also going to find that if you're doing more advanced or unique services and solutions, i.e., you've got, an Apple Watch that also needs to have service, or other devices like iPads, things like that, that oftentimes the MVNOs don't offer that as an option. Going direct to the network operator oftentimes is the best way to get all of those different devices connected. You'll also find that, again, as you get into more business-focused, business-oriented features and functionalities, that those network operators are going to have things that are an option for you. Things like fleet services. You could, from Verizon, you can get a device that you put in your kid's car that tracks their driving, and similar to those, those devices that like Progressive Insurance puts on your car to get you better insurance rates. So, with the direct to the network operators, oftentimes those are more of an option than with an MVNO. But overall, I think that the MVNOs serve a very important part of the landscape of wireless service in the US. I think it gives, a lot of people that are using service, they don't need unlimited data. They don't need to, push 10 gig a month of streaming Netflix with, high video quality. They're just still making phone calls with occasional text messages and using Google Maps to get them directions to where they're going. And so, they might use less than a gig of data a month. They might not really do anything advanced like, connecting their laptop to their phone to access the internet. And so oftentimes MVNOs are a great option. It's a very competitive marketplace. You can really shop and get great deals. You may sometimes have fewer options in terms of, phone models and stuff to choose from, but that may not be important. So I think they provide a great augmentation to your options in the consumer marketplace. And anytime you've got this level of competition, it's always good for us, the consumer. So that's kind of an overview of mobile virtual network operators in the US, especially. And, I hope that this kind of gives you a good perspective on how that works. If I missed anything, got anything wrong, as always, reach out to us at 5gguys.com. Love to get your comments, feedback. We're not always right. So if I miss something, we'll catch up on the next episode, kind of clarify that. You can always look on our blog posts, subscribe to our newsletter. We're always touching on these topics there as well. So thanks for joining once again. Until next time, we'll see you.
Thanks for listening to the 5G Guys. For more resources and to connect with Dan and Wayne, check out their website at 5gguys.com. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit that follow button and share this episode with your friends and family.